If you're hearing this, I'm already dead. I lead with that because it fixes the clock. No more embargoes. No more legal holds. No edits from people with badges and polite smiles. I am speaking now because delay is a weapon, and it's been used against this story since the night it was born. I have verified what I can. Names are changed. Specific coordinates are masked to protect live-in staff and hardware. But the bones of this are intact and on record. I cross-checked night shift rosters from a secure contract in Portal against payroll anomalies that match 2 weeks of hazard pay. I obtained thermal logs from a sealed hangar that never show a door opening, but show heat cliffs that only come from moving mass. I authenticated 2 hospital intake reports from Nye County, one coded as a dehydration event, one as panic syncope, both within 4 hours of a sensor blackout at the base. I have a maintenance ticket chain for a level 4 camera array, part of a ring that is supposed to make blind spots impossible, flagging intermittent self-reference and looped capture. I have the loop. I am not speculating. I am reconstructing. I matched tail numbers from 3 late-night flights, 1 contractor C-130, 2 whitetail Gulfstreams, against fuel chits filed under a shell vendor. I pulled down a radio check tape where every voice hits clean signal strength, but the time codes stutter, double, then reconcile as if the recorder blinked. I compared badge swipes against the map of a facility that officially has no corridors where those swipes occurred. Instruments noticed first. Human fear came later. This cannot go through normal channels. The people who control normal channels are the ones who turned the record into a rumor and then a joke. I tried the way you're supposed to try. I brought copies to a lawyer who used to work inside the classification machine. He read for 20 minutes and told me, with care, to put the pages down and pretend I never saw them. He said the markings alone could pull my life to pieces. XAP over SAP, caveats nested like locked boxes, ORCON, no foreign, RSR, owner-controlled, no foreign restricted special reporting. He said there is a list of stories that do not get told without a funeral first. He asked me if anyone would miss me. Someone will. That is the point. Human stakes are the only reason any of this matters. The operative at the heart of this told his story because he had someone waiting at home and didn't want that person to live off lies. He wanted his gear accounted for, his teammates named even undercover, and his fear put somewhere it could not be edited away. He wanted the public to know that the cameras we are told to trust did the thing cameras are not supposed to do. They watched, but they didn't save. The desert sets its own rules. Hot dust hangs in the throat around the dry lake bed. The hum off a transformer coil outside a cinder block outbuilding carries farther than it should in the night. There is a smell that new arrivals call ozone and old staff call the warning. The base on the map is lines and codes. The base in the body is a rhythm. Gate arm, badge flash, radial tires on caliche. The taste of the metal off ionized air near the high bay doors. Groom Lake looks empty on purpose. That emptiness is an instrument. I have seen the redaction blocks. I've listened to the parts that slid through anyway. On that night, a maintenance team received a quiet tasker. Verify integrity on a set of conduits beneath an older structure, hours, U100-0300, no photography, no personal devices, comms discipline. The mission read like a spreadsheet. Material accountability, environmental sampling, confirmation of a seal from the 1980s that should have been retired, a radiological survey where no radiological source is supposed to be. Paperwork that looks normal until you notice what is not there. No hazard brief. No chain of custody barcodes. No reason why a level 4 ring would be set to local buffer only. Cameras that watch. Cameras that don't save. I can say this much without risking a specific person. The operative was security. Not a tourist guard, not a tour guide with a sidearm. He wore an access band that opens doors most people in uniform never see. His clearance let him read what the camera saw. His clearance did not let him remember. The day after, every record showed uptime and normal operations. The hospital scan said dehydration. The promotion orders said excellence. The cold printer paper in his go bag said something else. A numeric label stamped into a rack faceplate he had never seen before. A designation that does not appear in any public database. A phrase so bureaucratic it disguises the horror. Protocol. Damascus. Anchor array. Bind. Contain. Awaken. I have held the flash drive that carries the loop. It is 4 minutes and 8 seconds long. The frame shows a corridor that does not exist in the official floor plan. The walls breathe. The grid marks on the floor grow half a degree brighter with each pulse. Footsteps pass with no bodies attached. The lens sees its own iris opening from a point behind itself. The array self-references. The machine looks at the machine looking. Then a man's voice, museum calm, trained calm, says, "We are not alone down here," and the audio collapses into a tone that is not a tone. The salt taste rises like a tide. The clip ends with a time code that does not exist. I am not trying to scare you. I am trying to put the truth where the erasers can't reach. I have spoken to people with other patches and other stories that rhyme with this one. North of the Arctic Circle, under cold ocean, inside a sealed radar dome where the dish kept painting itself. I will show those connections when it's time. For now, this is one night in Nevada, one team beneath a dry lake, one operative who refused to let his memory be the only archive. What follows is the operative's testimony. I was security, not parade detail. Cover title, Facilities Assurance, Actual Billet, Special Protective Measures, Restricted SAP. Clearance, TSSCI with caveats. I signed in a windowless room and never repeated out loud. The date on my logbook was 14th November, 02-10-05-30, local. Groom Lake, Nevada. GPS readout outside the South Service Gate, 37°14 Den, 115°48W. Unit cover story on the duty roster said we were a materials accountability sweep nested under Civil Engineering Squadron. We wore the CES patch because it kept questions shallow. The team was 5, including me. Call me Harlan. That's close enough. I ran point for access and containment. I carried a suppressed M17, a clipped PRC-163, 1 taser, 2 flex cuffs, 4 chem lights, and a door wedge I trusted more than most people. My job was to keep eyes on, maintain corridor control, and make sure none of my people got used as a missing variable in someone else's math. Voss was our EOD CBRN cross-qual. Quiet. Diesel mechanic hands. He kept a Pelican with M8, M9 paper, a handheld neutron rem meter with a cracked bezel, Draeger tubes, and an old ratty rosary he treated like a torque wrench. He wore a belt rig that never squeaked and had a way of sniffing the air that found leaks before instruments chirped. If he told me to back up, I backed up. Song handled comms and telemetry. Former SATCOM maintainer, now contractor. She ran a ruggedized laptop with fiber tails and a roll of LC connectors, plus a flat-pack analyzer that could tell you if a run had been spliced by a liar. She carried a small Faraday bag like a purse. Her headset mic was taped where the boom hinge had failed. She liked clean spectrums and clean coffee and got both more often than she should have. Delgado was materials and metallurgy. He could look at a weld bead and tell you who did it by the way the slag curled. He wore a loop magnifier on a lanyard and kept gloved fingers clean. He brought a thermal imager that read in Kelvin, and a paint marker set to leave notes on steel that wouldn't vanish under condensation. He had the patience for serials, rivet patterns, and the kind of inventory checklist that makes weak men lie. Hart was medical. Air Guard flight medic once, now industrial safety officer. She kept an aid bag light, almost ascetic. Compressed gauze, occlusive dressings, IV start kit, a Doppler pocket unit, and a tiny vial of phenylephrine she swore was for just in case. She checked our pupils in the truck and didn't smile when I made a joke about field sobriety. She had a 3D printed clip for her watch so it couldn't snag the suits. My human steak smelled like laundry detergent and lemon soap. Her name is not for this tape, but she texted me that night a picture of a key on a string. It was a house key I hadn't given her yet. We were going to sign on a place in Pahrump. 2 bedrooms, a fig tree that wouldn't live. A rent we could almost afford. I told her I'd be back before sunrise to measure the windows for shades. If you're late, she wrote, be late because of something honest. I promised. It took effort to type those words with a gloved thumb. The official mission brief was normal on the surface. Verify integrity of legacy conduits beneath a mothballed test bay on the west perimeter. Perform radiological survey to satisfy an environmental compliance audit. Confirm closure status on an old hot aisle that had been sealed before I enlisted. Pull air samples, wipe tests, record thermal deltas across gasket lines. No photography, no personal devices. Report anomalies only through the assigned comms channel. The slide deck showed 3 maps and an elevation diagram that looked like it had been photocopied since the 1980s. The fonts were wrong. The part numbers were right. We staged at a cinderblock cube that smelled like hot dust and burned coffee. The hum off the HVAC fought the click of the fluorescent starter and lost. On a folding table sat 4 dosimeters in a foam insert. They weren't serialized. That was the first tell. We signed for radiation badges like we signed for firearms. Numbers traced to names traced to blood draws. These had no numbers, just a faint grease pencil mark. 1, 2, 3, 4, like a child labeling treasure. Song powered her analyzer. The spectrum looked like a desert. Nothing but noise. Then a thin picket fence rose at the low end. Not RF. Not anything I had names for. Probably a generator somewhere throwing harmonics, Delgado said, casual. He even leaned back to sell it, but his foot tapped and kept tapping. Voss sniffed the air once and didn't look satisfied. The briefing officer had no name tag. His hair was cut to a regulation he didn't owe anyone. He kept a memo folder closed the entire time and never touched the slides on the screen. He told us to treat this as a go light evolution. Low signature, minimal notifications, no call-outs to other shops. He used the phrase, no third parties, and looked at me as if I were the third party. He skipped the hazard brief and the spill response. He did not ask for our next of kin cards. He did not ask because he already knew or didn't care. I couldn't tell which one was worse. I checked the level 4 camera ring assigned to our route. The matrix should have read uplink mirrored. It read local buffer only. That setting made sense during a cyber exercise, where you isolate segments to hunt malware. It did not make sense on a live integrity check with potential radiological exposure. Cameras that watch. Cameras that don't save. I flagged it. The officer said it was a temporary bandwidth constraint. Song looked at me over her monitor and mouthed, "No." I logged the anomaly in a notebook I kept inside my vest because keyboards lie and paper bleeds slow. We rolled in a white box truck that smelled like solvent and sunflower seeds. Badge color at the gate was copper for the driver, silver for the rest. The guards scanned each with a flat wand and watched the readout like a gambler. The access arm rose smooth. The night was the kind that eats sound. Tires on caliche. Sodium lights throwing out a cone that made my pupils clamp down and my stomach turn. The truck heater blew air that tasted faintly metallic, like you get after a dentist uses the scaler too long. Song did comms checks on the move. PRC 163 to base. Base to our assigned relay. Relay to a utility closet that would be our local switch. Everything read green. The strength meters showed full bars and no packet loss. The time code ticked steady for 3 beats, then jumped back half a second and caught up. "Hiccup," she said, but her voice didn't own the word. I tapped the watch face clipped on my vest. Quartz doesn't drift like that. Mine did. Half a second, then right again. I clicked the door wedge in my pocket because the feel of the rubber chevrons brought the world back to measurements I could trust. Delgado unfolded the elevation diagram across his knee. He pointed with a paint-markered thumbnail. "We enter here. South egress on the old vent corridor. 31 steps to the gasket line." He liked numbers that fit in a mouth. Voss checked the REM meter and got nothing. The needle rested like it was asleep. He tapped the casing and got a lazy wink. Hart passed out salt tabs like communion. She watched us put them under our tongues. We parked behind a berm where the wind dumped sand into a shallow curl. The bay ahead wore a steel door that had been painted beige and then sunbit into chalk. The keypad looked newer than the lintel. I tapped in a code from the morning's dispatch. The light winked red, then green. The smell inside was old paper and machine oil and that too clean ozone bite you get when something's been powered longer than policy allows. The corridor lights glowed at the edges, like eyes seen through a curtain. The floor grit under my boot told me no one had swept this lane in a week. My heel found a spot where the concrete had spalled to reveal aggregate the color of wet bone. Song plugged her fiber tail into the wall jack. The analyzer showed a happy flat line. Then the low-end pickets rose again, faint, regular, as if someone in the corner was striking a triangle at set intervals. "Not RF," she said before I could ask. "Not in any lookup I have." She touched her ear. "But the headset hum is new." I heard it too, a thread under the AC, not a tone as much as a pressure. The taste in my mouth went metallic and thin. The officer with no name tag had not assigned an escort from base security. That was unusual. We don't go into sealed legacy lanes without someone whose whole job is to count us back out. He'd said our team lead could cover the head count. He was looking at me when he said it. That put the number in my pocket like a hot coin. The last time I'd watched someone skip an escort, we were walking into a training tunnel under Nellis, and the skip turned into a drill where the point man became a hostage. Good lesson. It did not feel like a lesson tonight. We proceeded by the book anyway. I called the route. South Corridor, old vents, conduit integrity, 2 turns, then gasket line. We wore half-face respirators that made every breath a measured thing. The rubber smelled like new tires and hospital. Hart checked our pupils again under her pen light and said nothing, which in her language was permission. We took the first turn. The temperature rose by a degree. Delgado's thermal imager confirmed a seam in the wall where none should be. A rectangle the size of a submarine hatch, except the steel wasn't Navy. It had the grain of Soviet-era plate, different manganese content, different weld pattern, a history you could smell if you believed men like Delgado. Burn scoring edged the seam like someone had tried to cut in and change their mind. Hot air breathed from the gaps. Not much, just enough to fog Hart's lenses for a beat and make her step back. Voss raised the rem meter again. The needle didn't care. I logged each anomaly. Local buffer only or not, papers still mattered. Unserialized dosimeters issued, I wrote. Spectrum irregularities at low frequency. Briefing omitted hazard brief and emergency response. Escort skipped. Timecode hiccup on comms. Temperature rise near sealed hatch. Heat signature consistent with active equipment. External plate appears wrong era. When I write like that, I don't feel anything. That is the point. We reached the gasket line that should have been a dead end. The map said, old vent. The wall said stop. GPS doesn't work underground, but my tracker gave me a breadcrumb that still thought it was outside and placed us 30 meters west of our own footprints. Song tapped her screen and frowned. Packet round trip just did something weird. It went to relay, to switch, and then answered from us. I didn't like the pronoun. Voss's rosary clicked in his pocket like a counter. The first hint something was off had already spread into many hints. A briefing officer who never touched his slides. Cameras set to watch but not remember. EM notes that found a fence where no transmitter lived. A hatch made from the wrong country's metal-breathing heat in a cold corridor. Command-skipping paperwork that existed to keep our families out of court. One of those you can excuse. Altogether, they make a shape. I thumbed the radio. Base, Team Echo, at gasket line, preparing to verify seal. The reply came back clean. The timecode did not. It blinked and returned. My watch agreed with both wrong answers. I looked at the door wedge in my hand and thought about the house key on a string on a kitchen counter 40 miles away. "Let's make the cut," Delgado said. He was already drawing lines with the paint marker that would survive sparks. Voss pulled a cutter from his kit and set teeth against steel that did not belong under Nevada. Song crouched at the wall jack, finger against the transmit key. Eyes narrowed on a flat line that had started to stutter like a tired heart. Hart rested 2 fingers on my wrist for a second, as if checking my pulse. She didn't need to. We were all on the same metronome. We masked up. I called the countdown. The blade bit. The sparks jumped and died faster than physics usually allows. The smell was new. Hot dust, then old oil, then something like a struck match under water. The metal sang a note that didn't echo right. Delgado glanced at me once, the way a man looks at a friend when a bar fight is about to become a war. I nodded. He cut. We rolled from the cinder block cube to the west perimeter in a white box truck with a contractor barcode and a magnet strip that said civil engineering on one side and nothing on the other. I signed for the keys from a guy who smelled like brake cleaner and peppermint, and the clipboard under his elbow hid a printout with a tail number I knew by shape. C130H, contractor paint, last 4, 7, 9, 3, 2. That Hercules had ferried a pallet of conduit spares into Groom 2 nights prior and filed the fuel chit under a shell vendor I'd seen on 3 other jobs where the paperwork didn't want to meet daylight. We weren't riding the Herc, but it was part of our approach whether we liked it or not. You don't patch a ghost run without first delivering new ghosts. Wind out of the north. 42 degrees Fahrenheit at 0220 hours, dropping. Stars so clean they looked etched. Sodium vapor pools between hangars. Shadows hard as dropped tools. The base at night ran like a clock you could feel through your vest. Distant generator thrum at 60 hertz. HVAC hums staggered by phase. A high transformer whine that sat in the molars. We pass the big numbers stenciled on pavement that pretend to be for tourists but are for pilots with eyes full of black. Groom Lake itself was a slate. Invisible air over an invisible runway. We kept our headlights low. Song worked comms checks on cadence. Echo to relay. Clean. Relay to switch. Clean. Switch to echo. Clean. We ran the same loop again and watched the status lights on our PRC 163s reflect off the windshield. The time code ticked 123 and then hiccuped into a half-second double and resolved. Not a lot. Just enough for my watch to disagree with itself. I said nothing. I've learned to bank anomalies until the pattern becomes a shape. We passed a chain-link run that hid a stack of fiber reels under a camo tarp. Delgado glanced once and said, "Corning OS2, not base stock." He had a way of making inventory feel like interrogation. OS2 meant single-mode fiber, meant long runs, meant someone had stretched glass where maps said dead end. I logged it because paper makes liars work harder. Terrain to the west stood up as scrub and caliche mounds, man-made berms with the natural scab of wind. The approach to the mothballed test bay ran along a concrete lane scored with joint cuts that sang under tires like a muted metronome. The smell inside the cab was solvent, dust, Hart's lemon hand gel, and the faint metal of the heater core. We talked as little as we could. Many good teams confuse silence with superstition. Ours treated it as bandwidth for instruments. At the last turn, a security sign told a joke we all knew. Authorized personnel only. Beneath it, a sticker someone had tried to peel. Property of nobody. Delgado snorted once, a breath. We rolled into the lee of the berm and killed the engine. The wind kept talking. Dust skittered on the concrete in a dry hiss. When I stepped down, grit found the edge of my boot tread and reminded me the ground had a memory. I checked badge colors. Copper for the driver at the last gate had been a rental level. Silver for the rest meant escort required. We had none. My chest felt the absences more than the cold. I keyed my shoulder mic. Echo on site. The reply bounced back through relay and carried an artifact like breath over a bottle. Not a tone. Pressure. Song's analyzer tablet registered a low picket at subaudible and wrote it down in a format that would mean something to her. The first instrument anomaly hit a beat later. Delgado's thermal imager picked an outline on the bay door 12 degrees above ambient. No source, no motors, no bodies. Heat without origin. He tightened his jaw and made it a number instead of a fear. We did the walk. Terrain, slab to hatch, 20 meters, no cover. One floodlight failed on the southern mast, throwing a crescent of soft dark onto the door that should not have been comforting. Weather, dry north wind, stinging eyes, a taste of ozone that made the tip of the tongue go numb. Base layout, perpendicular lanes, labeling worn down to ghosts, a stenciled B07, near the jam that didn't match any current map. Comms. Green, green, green. My watch, plus half second, then fine. Songs spectral. Clean with a periodic rise at low-end intervals like someone exhaling behind a wall. We masked up before entry. Hart's fingers were brisk at my collar, checking the seal. The rubber smell of the respirator put my head in a place where every breath was intentional. The door keypad acted like a trained dog. Red, then green, then the heavy clack. Inside, the air shifted from night to old machine oil and paper. My eyes took a second to sign the NDA the lighting demanded. The corridor ahead was one shade removed from dark, lit by fixtures that remembered another decade. I lay out corridor discipline because that is how I kept us alive. Wedge ready, chem light at hand, M17 heavy but familiar, Voss on my 4 with the REM meter, Delgado Center with thermal, Song glued to the wall jack at each interval, Hart ghosting behind to watch us without becoming a block in the lane. My job was to call the beat, look for lie geometry, feel where the building didn't want to be looked at. The first corner presented naked. We took it in sequence. The floor grit told me traffic had been light. A faint drag mark ran parallel to the baseboard and faded as if time had sanded it. I filed it under, people try to hide the weird by cleaning it away, but weird sinks in. We passed a junction where a sign in an old font promised Vent SVC. Arrow right. Our map agreed in theory and disagreed in detail. The arrow pointed to the wall. The map said Vent Corridor. The wall said wrong. We kept left because wrong was the reason we came. Song jacked into a port labeled in a typeface that died before I learned to shave. Her analyzer showed a clean loop and then returned an echo from our own MAC addresses. "It thinks we're already there," she said, voice flat, trained. A sensor ticked across my spine like a finger. Before the hatch, I took inventory of what we carried because lists are the antidote to doubt. 4 dosimeters with grease pencil labels instead of serials. 1 REM meter with a crack across the bezel. 1 thermal imager reading heat without origin. 1 comms loop that burped time out of order and answered before we spoke. The first instrument anomaly had eyes now. The system believed we stood in a place we hadn't reached. I have learned to take a step back when maps insist I am somewhere else. The corridor did not allow it. The only way out was forward or more forward. I let us breathe, not a speech, just a count with my eyes on their hands. Voss flexed his fingers once and let them fall calm. Hart's watch sat in that 3D printed clip like it had been born there. Delgado's paint marker tapped his thumb, a single dot of white on glove knuckle. Song rotated the screen brightness down 2 clicks and dragged a window to watch for whisper traffic on the fiber. I said, "We do this by the book, or not at all." Nobody argued because arguing means you think there is a door behind you. At the gasket line, we paused. Concrete met metal in a seam so tight it looked painted. Heat licked from the gaps like breath through teeth. "No way a mothball bay keeps this warm at 0240 with no load," Delgado said. His voice came out of the respirator like a man speaking through a pillow. He drew the cut lines with the paint marker that would stand up to sparks. Voss laid out his cutter with movements that made a religion out of process. Song wired the wall jack so our local buffer would catch what our uplink would pretend didn't exist. I pressed the wedge into my palm until the rubber gave and knew the house key on a string existed because my hand remembered shapes. I radioed base for the record. Team Echo at Seal, preparing to verify. The answer came back in 2 layers that met but did not marry. content fine, timing wrong. I wrote the time from my watch anyway. Numbers are bones. When the flesh gets eaten, you still know what the shape used to be. We cut when I called it. The sparks jumped, died fast, and skittered along the floor like insects that hate light. The smell was matchhead under water, old oil, hot dust. The metal sang a note so pure it made my teeth feel loose. The blade advanced slow, patient, like a goodbye we didn't agree with. The seam widened until a line of black stood up between us and the inside of the wall. Hot breath rolled out and fogged Hart's lenses. She whispered a curse that fogged them more. When the piece fell, it didn't clang. It thumped like leather on carpet. Voss steadied the plate with gloved hands and eased it down. The hole we made breathed. Warm air, dry, not the scent of servers or transformers. Older. I felt it in the sinus first, a taste like standing near a photocopier that has never been turned off. We shone lights in and saw stairs that were not on any map. The approach ended there because everything after that step stopped being surface. The brief had said, "Legacy conduits beneath." The stairs said, "This was built to be found by people who did not ask permission." I checked my counter, 5 in, 5 out, or nothing meant anything. I went first because that is what I was for. Surface told one story. Instruments told another. On the slab above, the base was empty in the way deserts specialize in. Miles of nothing that hides everything. In the mouth of the new hole, our GPS trackers showed confidence while lying. Green icons that insisted we were 30 meters west of our own boots and 10 meters higher than our heads. Thermal showed a column of warm air rising through a space the map swore didn't exist. We stood on top of it by both measures. A void, no paperwork admitted, lined up exactly under our feet. The access point looked wrong because it had the right wrongness. The steel plate wore the grain and weld language of Soviet submarine hatch metal, alloy content tilted, bead pattern too fat, slag curls like commas. Delgado ran a gloved fingertip across the cut edge and said the thing that made bile taste like a chemical, not a replica. The burn scoring around the seam wasn't fresh. It lived there like age spots. Heat breathed from the stairwell and licked our masks. Cold night met warm old air and made a boundary layer you could almost see. When my boot toes crossed it, my skin decided to sweat. Sensory wrongness start as whispers. First came a radio tone that wasn't a tone, just a standing pressure in the headsets like being 3 meters underwater and told to listen. Then chanting, except no language caught it and no throat owned it. It was a cadence without syllables, a rhythm with consonants missing. The dark sand inside the threshold carried an oil sheen you could see if you knelt and let the beam skate low. Grains stuck to the glove like filings to a magnet. Voss rubbed 2 between his fingers and sniffed. "Not oil," he said. "Not anything I know." We prepped the breach by the book because rituals keep fear small. Voss placed 2 cutting charges in the event we needed to widen our entry for a stretcher. He shaped them tight and marked with a paint arrow so we could find them blind. I staged the door wedge and a chem light at the lip. The wedge to hold the world in one piece. The light to tell us which way home looked if geometry got cute. Song set a local recorder on a loop with redundant power and wrote the file name on her glove with a marker, because cameras lie but Sharpie doesn't. Delgado chalked a symbol on the wall he'd used on other jobs. A triangle in a circle with a dot. He said it wasn't superstition. He said if we started to repeat ourselves, we'd know. We threw sparks in the stairwell as a test. They flew, arced, died fast, as if the air had been bled of oxygen and replaced with the idea of air. Physics obeyed, but reluctantly. My shoulders tightened at the shoulders, doing shoulder work without permission. I leaned into the rubber seal of the respirator and tasted old copper. Heart squeezed my forearm once, pulse check and consolation both. I didn't pull away. We started down. The handrail was cold sweat steel, a stickiness you can't see but feel. 30 to 50 meters was the brief's worst case. The stair pitched that deep by the second landing. The stair stringers had bolt heads with the manufacturer's stamp that went out of business before I was born. Each tread sang a tiny note when we stepped. The smell shifted. Hot dust, then baked stone, then ionized air. My breath counted us into a space that wanted to count us first. Instruments registered behaviors that insulted their own manuals. Cameras stayed live, battery good, lens clock synced, yet wrote nothing but 0-byte files. The status LEDs blinked obediently as if a filing clerk could be bribed by light. Radios showed connected, meters full, but when Song keyed and spoke my name, the reply arrived as a flattened copy, a layer below speech where meaning had been sanded off. Compass drift walked 8 degrees west and refused to step back. Delgado's thermal showed heat bleeding from the concrete in veins like a handprint, except the hand was a floor. At the 20-meter mark, the wall texture changed. The poured concrete gave way to something older, aggregate with inclusions that looked like vitrified quartz, edges melted and rehardened centuries ago or yesterday under different math. Symbols appeared at stair landings, burned shallow into the surface. Repeating geometry nested within geometry, arcs folding into triangles, measures that made the eye try to find the pattern and fail. Looking for too long produced a pressure behind the nose that built toward a headache and then backed off like surf. We learned to glance and pass. The chanting grew not louder, but clearer. It stopped being a sound and became a thing that offered to be sound. It pressed itself into the space behind the inner ear and held a beat we could count even when we tried not to. It wasn't X. It was Y. Not music. Instruction. The radio pressure synced with it, so gently we didn't notice until we all stopped in the same instant and looked at each other through lens fog. At 36 meters, the stair terminated in a landing with a door frame and no door. Just an aperture and the idea of a door. The edge revealed metal switchbacks inside the concrete, like reinforcing bar in a pattern that pretended to be ornamental. Hot air exhaled across the landing and mapped itself onto my skin as if heat could draw hands. A footprint appeared in the dust past the threshold. It walked one step forward and then didn't. No shadow walked with it. My brain wrote the shadow in, and then the place took the pencil away. We prepped again because rules are bones. I put the wedge under the stair door that didn't exist because the part of me that believed in leverage hadn't died yet. I laid a chemlight at the lip and cracked it. The glow made a line that meant home. Song took one more try at the camera. Unplug plug, status light green, file index tick, content 0. She swore under her breath in a language I didn't share and tightened the recorder to her rig so tight the plastic creaked. Voss rolled M8 paper and brushed it against the threshold. No color change. The chanting didn't care. We crossed in 2-count intervals. I went first, then Delgado, then Voss, then Song, then Hart. My boot stepped into a world with air and math and a floor, but none of those things had the courtesy to behave. The light from our lamps bent around the corners in a way that made it seem as if the dark had elbows. The space smelled of transformer varnish and something like wet stone after a kiln opens. We entered knowing the surface was a series of lies told by people who'd learned to live with them. Under us, truth had a different shape. The vertical drop put us somewhere between 30 and 50 meters down. My knees voted for 50. The stair emptied into a corridor whose proportions were wrong by a degree so small it wouldn't hold still. The ceiling turned our lamp beams aside a hair early, like light had friction. The floor wore concrete, but the aggregate showed inclusions that looked scorched and then frozen. Edges bubbled smooth as if poured over something that fought back and lost. Every 10 meters a landing, symbols burned shallow into the surface, repeating geometry that hurt to stare at. Triangles nested inside arcs nested inside a lattice of measures that refused to click into familiarity. I counted 6 unique configurations before I stopped, because counting built a headache behind my eyes like a tide hammering a seawall. Gear began to act like it had been given new orders by a boss we didn't know. Cameras watched but didn't record. Song checked her recorder after every corridor segment and found 0-byte placeholders, file names, timestamps, no content. The status LEDs blinked a reassuring lie. She tethered the body cam to the ruggedized laptop so the feed would loop straight into solid state and then into a spinning drive because sometimes old tech ignores new lies. We got file names and no pictures. Radios showed connected in confident letters, signal meters fat. But when I keyed up with echo to relay, the reply came back in my voice, clipped flat, stripped of words, as if the system had decided to simulate compliance rather than send it. Compass drift slid west another 4 degrees and stalled there, exhausted. At the first bend, the air temperature rose by 2. The smell moved from old machine oil to something like the inside of a breaker box in August. Varnish and ozone and a copper tang that made the tongue go slick. Dust on my gloves felt gritty fine like fresh ground glass. The hum lived in the concrete now, a transformer thrum transmitted through bones. It settled into the wrist where my watch sat and convinced the second hand to forget its contract with time. I tapped the face out of habit. It corrected itself, affronted, like a clerk restacking a file I'd knocked askew. Symbols deepened. What started as shallow burns turned into grooves that caught light. When my lamp passed, the black lines drank photons and did not return them the way paint would. Delgado muttered the way metallurgists pray, alloys and grain structure and heat-affected zones. He touched a groove with the back of a glove like a man testing a stovetop for a burner left on. It cooled wrong, he said. It cooled like someone pushed on it from the other side while it was molten. The geometry repeated without repeating, a jazz riff with no bar line. We marked our route with tapes and paint and the triangle and circle with dot Delgado had drawn above. The symbols on the wall had their own rotation. At each landing they shifted one interval in a pattern that teased comprehension. My brain kept almost knowing and then forgetting. The forgetting hurt more. I heard footsteps before I saw anything cast them. Not our cadence, not a cadet's panic. A measured walk with weight and a slight hitch, like someone carrying a load that didn't exist. The sound's directionality slipped. One beat, it was ahead. The next, it was behind. Voss turned his head and his jaw tightened, and then he pretended it was nothing. I let the noise pass and filed it with voices you hear in old buildings that turn out to be pipes. Rational lies protect morale until they don't. We reached an intersection where the corridor teed into a wider space. The floor there had no dust for 3 steps in, as if feet had walked and walked again. My chem lights drew a line behind us that behaved like light. The edge of the glow hit a wall line and bent a fractional degree wrong, as if geometry hiccuped. I waved the beam left and watched it return late, not much, but enough to feel in the back teeth. Heart squeezed my elbow, and I realized my shoulders had hiked up around my ears. I put them down. At 39 meters by my count, the corridor opened into a cut room. Walls structured like a vault, ceiling taller than the feel of the building we'd sensed so far. A space that told my body one volume while my eyes read another. The grid on the floor stretched when I didn't look directly at it and snapped back when I did. The air had that fresh ion bit you get when a power plant spins up, except no plant invited us to look. Bolted to the walls in brackets and trays ran cabling and conduit. Modern, labeled in English, heat shrink sleeves with barcodes and asset tags, fiber spines with LC connectors, all sunk into metal equipment older than English. Bronze-like plates studded with rivets wore rack ears that held Dell and HP gear. Ancient met modern like a graft a surgeon made with a hammer. We hadn't arrived at the main chamber, we were still in the descent. But its upstream told the story. Someone had threaded our era through a machine that belonged to another. The repeating geometry burned into the concrete-matched engravings on the bronze ribs. The labels on the patch panels had an English word that would come back later with a shape around it. Damascus. Not the city. The protocol. Stenciled here and there in block font made by a label maker, Damascus Array, Anchor Feed, Bind Loop. Gear misbehavior sharpened into personality. Song's analyzer pulled up link topologies that charted connections between our laptop and ports that did not exist. When she pinged one, the reply came with time-to-live values that were plausible for a local switch and then flipped to values that belonged to a satellite hop and then back in the same packet capture. Radios responded to human check-ins with polite silence, and to silence with ghost acknowledgments that played at the edge of hearing like someone saying, "Copy," from inside a pillow. The first entity glimpse arrived like a bad card flip. Footsteps passed through the door we hadn't opened yet. They carried a shadow made two-dimensional by our lamps. But when the shape crossed a seam of burned geometry, the shadow detached, skated left, and hung on the wall like a sticker while the footfalls continued right. Voss inhaled sharp through the mask. Hart put a hand to my back and steadied me without making a story of it. The shadow crept along the groove and then, in a way that made less sense than the wrongness that preceded it, rejoined nothing at the far corner. A radiator hum rose in the bones of the room, a coil alive after years of off. I tasted copper and printed circuit board dust and a little heat from fear. We took the next landing because there was no version where we did not. The corridor narrowed and deepened into a chute where my lamp beam found dust motes that moved like flakes in a viscous fluid. Symbols on the walls got closer together. My field of view carried 3 at once and my eyes couldn't focus on any. My watch second hand shivered in place and then lurched forward 2 ticks as if paid a bonus. Song whispered that the file system had adopted new directories she hadn't created. Names like anchor, lock, and bind, heartbeat flashed into existence and then denied access even to root. "We're not root," she said, a joke in search of oxygen. At 47 meters by stair count, the floor shifted slope, and my calf muscles reported the change up the chain. The air pressed down like a room filled with the smell of photocopier toner multiplied by a cathedral. I say cathedral, not because there was anything religious carved here, but because the proportions coerced the spine into respect. It wasn't myth, it was math. A vault built to keep fields from walking. Human hands had cut stair treads. Something older had chosen where they ended. The second entity glimpse came to Song first in the corner of her analyzer's screen. A thumbnail of our own camera feed, a thing that could not exist because the camera wrote 0 bytes, played back a frame of our corridor, August 5, frozen, as if caught by a speed trap. Then the thumbnail flickered, and we were not in it, and the corridor was not the corridor we stood in. The walls bowed. The floor grid changed scale. The symbols rearranged like a shuffling deck. Then the box went black, and the directory, bind, heartbeat, incremented a number without showing its contents. Song's breathing went fast for 3 beats. Then trained pace returned. She asked me to confirm I could still feel my watch on my wrist. I could. It felt heavier than a watch should be. We reached the last landing. A door frame yawned. Beyond it, a chamber breathed like a mechanical lung. Warm air in. Warm air out. The hum set itself to a triad. Bind, contain, awaken. The triad matched the rhythm under the radio pressure and the not chanting that had taught itself to be a sound. I raised a hand and all 5 of us stopped, trained animals at a trainer's small sign. The machine on the other side of the threshold was not myth. It was switchgear and bronze ribs and field shapers that had worn English names they didn't deserve. The descent had ended. The rules had already started to bend. Machine temple reveal. The chamber didn't open so much as admit us like a pressure door giving up a secret. The space was tall beyond the math of the corridor we'd walked. Our beams climbed and couldn't find a true ceiling, just ribs, bronze dark and riveted, curving up into shadow. Between those ribs ran modern ladder trays, fiber and armored cable, every line labeled in English, every tag a contemporary asset code. Bronze plates wore rack ears that held Dell and HP servers like barnacles. At the center stood a ringed assembly the size of a small rotor, ribbed like a turbine. But the blades were not blades. They were field shapers, a geometry of veins tuned to bend something heavier than air. The hum we'd felt as pressure outside the skin became a chord here, a 3-note engine, bind, contain, awaken. I followed the cables because cables tell the truth. Conduit from a wall. Transformer, 480V, 3-phase, fed into a bus. Red epoxy stenciled with a label maker strip. Damascus array. Anchor feed. From the bus, heavy outflow ran into ceramic-insulated posts on the bronze ribs. Data fiber, OS2 single mode, crossed in looms and landed at switches with familiar logos. The management console sat on a rolling cart like it belonged in a help desk, not a vault. The login splash carried a crest I didn't recognize and a build date that was last month. The host name, Damascus Protocol 02. The wallpaper, a grayscale of the same symbols burned into the concrete outside, tiled like wallpaper, repeating without repeating. Delgado walked to a rib and set his glove to a rivet. "Not bronze," he said after a beat. "Bronze plus something else. Nickel, maybe. It's not a museum piece. It's alloyed to live hot. He tapped the metal with a knuckle and listened the way welders listen. The ring answered in a pitch that got under the skin. Voss swept with the rem meter. The needle twitched as if embarrassed to be wrong, settled near baseline, then shivered again. Not neutrons, he said. Not gamma in any way I'm trained for. The taste in my mouth shifted from copper to photocopier. Transformer ozone, a little hot dust, an afterbite like a 9-volt on the tongue. Song jacked her analyzer into the top-of-rack switch. The topology mapped like a small city. The core router called itself Bridge 0. Half the routes looked like loop-back tunnels, half went nowhere in human geography. She ran tracer route. Hop counts came back plausible, then impossible, then plausible again within the same capture. Translation layers, she said. Half our packets are getting answered by a thing pretending to be us. The rest are answered by something that thinks it's further away than orbit. She set her recorder to span the mirror ports and watched directories appear. Anchor, lock, bind, heartbeat, delta, outgassing. She mouthed the words without voicing them, as if sound would solidify them. I found the logbooks because the human habit of writing never dies. Not paper. System logs printed to a thermal roll and torn neat at the serrations, stuffed under a keyboard as if someone might come back after coffee. The lines were bureaucratic. Damascus Protocol status, anchor hold 91.6%. AUX feed nominal, delta tau within tolerance. Underneath, someone had written in pen, not label maker, do not starve the core. If field drops below 84%, shear. A follow-up note in another hand. Shear, ED-shirt, not our problem. The pen pressure carved the paper as if the writer wanted the letters to survive fire. System name, I said, pointing. Song read it, made a face, and typed it anyway. Damascus Protocol. Not myth. A procedure. On the next rack, a thin aluminum faceplate bore stamped letters. Damascus. Anchor Array. Groom 03. Serial numbers matched the label strips. English welded to something older than English. The ribs bore engraved lines. That matched the stair symbols. The angles were not decoration. They were calibration, a language that taught metal to remember a shape. What is it anchoring? Hart asked no one and everyone. The answer sat in the numbers. Core current draw, steady at a value that suggested it was pushing against something that pushed back. Heat, flux mapped to the ribs like veins bringing blood to a skin that wasn't skin. The ring breathed through airflow that didn't stir dust. This was not a generator, not an engine, not a bomb. It was a clamp. Nuclear power, drawn from the grid somewhere up lake, buttressed by local diesel as a buffer, had been yoked to hold a boundary. A dimensional anchor. A bridge that didn't cross so much as pin. We kept it technical because technical keeps myth out. The control console surfaced a panel labeled Field Integrity. A bar crawled across at 91.6%. Under it, bind mass est unknown. Under that, heartbeat received true. Interval variable. A graph crawled with peaks like an EKG a medic would hate. Timestamp stuttered and then corrected. Song pulled a config file and found human language comments. If field falls, activate shear to prevent ingress. Ingress. The other direction had a name. Egress didn't appear. Someone wired a temple to a server room, Delgado said, looking up into the ribs. Then they taught the server room to pray. It wasn't theology. It was practical. Sacrificial geometry, field shapers, tuned conductors. Old metal carried modern load because old metal had been carved to receive it. The core horror rested in the economy. Power thrown into a shape that made space stiffer where it needed to be stiff. Bind, contain, awaken, only if you starved it. We walked the perimeter and found inspection points like ports in a submarine hull. Small covers popped to reveal crystals mounted in brass cages. Not quartz you'd wear on a chain, but cut pillars with electrode bands, wired into differential amplifiers feeding ADC cards, English silk screen, part numbers, a contract from a vendor in Oregon. Handwritten grease pencil dated each inspection. The oldest dates lived in the early 90s, then stepped right into last week as if time were a maintenance schedule. Above the core, suspended on a horseshoe gantry, hung a cap made of the same not bronze. Its underside bore a pattern of inlays that looked like printed spirals. They weren't. Closer, they were tiny bars, ferromagnetic, set like fingerprints. When my lamp passed across them, the bars sang at the edge of hearing and the compass in my pocket made a lazy circle. Voss looked green around the gills and muttered a prayer into his mask. The rosary in his cargo pocket clicked as if a hand had found it for him. I kept asking the questions I could live with hearing out loud. What's the cost? Because machines like this don't run on goodwill. The logs answered in indirect lines. Personnel variance accepted. Delta T memory. Nominal. Loss budget. Human factor. The words hammered down to one thing. This array ate the difference between what should be and what was. It took it from the grid, from diesel, and when the curve slipped, from us. Time debt, memory skim, life measured in quieter ways than blood. We had not met the thing this held back. We had met its shape by the hole it pressed in the world. The hum, the footsteps without shadows, the shadow without feet, the corridor that thought it was wider when we didn't look at it. These were signatures at the edge of a field. The anchor made those signatures polite. It made the difference small enough that the base above could pretend its cameras worked. The label strip warned us what happened if polite ended. Heart checked pulses without comment. Song set a timer that would read wrong and knew it. Delgado chalked another triangle circle dot on the floor near the core and told no one why. Voss leaned into the REM meter and let it tell him nothing because the needle had run out of names. I took a breath that tasted like hot varnish and decided we would not touch the shear. Something moved then beyond the ribs. Not a shape, not a person, but a lensing. Light leaned as if bent by heat mirage and then didn't return correctly. The air jittered a finger's worth and stood still again. Footfalls came from no direction and all directions with a hitch, as before. We were not alone. The system knew that. The label on the console had known it for years. The parlay began before a voice. The first contact was refraction where no heat lived. Height wrong by a handspan each second, limbs at human ratios until they weren't. A boundary that couldn't pick an outline. Our lamps didn't fix it. Light skated off as if the thing wore the room like a suit. When it stood, the field meters that weren't field meters sighed. The heartbeat graph on the console ticked a faster interval and then steadied. I took a step between it and the core because that's what you do when your job is to put your body in the math. Words didn't start. Offer did. A set of ideas arrived in order, fast, like someone handing us pages we somehow already knew how to read. The sense wasn't mystical, it was transactional, as if briefers had prepared bullets for our nervous systems. The points landed clean. The array held an edge, and something was on the other side pressing to equalize. The anchor didn't close a door, It pinned a seam. The price to keep the seam pinned was energy first, then human remainder when the curve dipped. Our remainder, time shaved around the edges, memory shaved where we'd never look. A siphoned head count measured in moments a clock wouldn't miss. If we left now, it implied, we'd pay later. Not blood, debt. I said out loud what the briefs would never put on paper. You're offering a deal. My voice sounded fine to me and flat in the headset. It answered by adjusting the room's rhythm. Bind, contain. You awaken, folded to bind, contain, maintain. A choice then. We stay and become part of the containment, join the lost budget as planned, predictable donors, or we leave and carry the imbalance with us until it collected. Paid either way. Define cost, Hart said, steel under the mask. The reply presented sketches that were not pictures but settled like memories we hadn't lived. A hand with a ring that shouldn't exist because the proposal hadn't happened yet, and would never. A voice speaking that came out machine clear because its owner had sold vowels. A textbook flipped to a page that belonged to another species' anatomy and still made sense. It wasn't threat theater. It was a ledger, shown honest. Voss swallowed and clutched his pocket. The rosary clicked a warning. He asked it a question he meant for himself. If we make the bind stronger tonight, do we buy time for those above? The field steadied to a nicer chord for 2 beats. Relief moved through his shoulders like warmth. Then the graph bumped and reminded us that kindness here was a byproduct, not intent. Song spoke like a tech at a keyboard briefing a senior who pretended to understand. If we tie in, it will learn us. It's already made directories with names it thinks we'll accept. It will sand our edges so we fit the loop. We won't know what we gave. She didn't look at me when she said it, but I felt the sentence land in the pocket with my door wedge and the memory of a key on a string. Human steak grew teeth. Delgado asked the thing a question only a metals man would ask. What are those ribs aligning to? An idea came back. Not north, not celestial coordinates as we use them. A grid that predates maps. Angles cut to match a stress in the crust like rebar. It let us understand just enough to increase our fear and our respect. It wasn't X. It was Y. Not a monster in a cave. A force with a maintenance schedule. The offer pinned us against ourselves. Submit and become part of the clamp. Measured contributions, predictable losses, no sudden surprises, or decline and accept randomization. Costs delivered as accidents, medical anomalies, time skews that put us out of step with our own kitchens. I watched my team as the ledger widened. Voss seeing a life measured in small prayers, shaved thin. Song seeing directories appear where her name should have been. Delgado seeing his hands remember alloys that didn't exist, and finding the knowledge useful and wrong. Hart seeing her watch keep perfect time while every pulse she touched refused the beat. I thought about the person waiting with a key on a string and how a house becomes a coffin if the clocks inside decide to do their own math. I don't like destiny, but I respect cost. We weren't here to sign compacts with a room. We were here to verify seals, take measurements, and leave with all 5 backs accounted for. The deal tried to dress itself as duty. Duty didn't require an altar. Not. Signing, I said, and to my own surprise, my voice held steady. We keep your anchor fed the right way. No volunteers, no losses we don't understand. The refraction stuttered a disapproval that wasn't anger. The heartbeat graph ticked at a higher tempo for 3 counts. The field integrity meter dipped 0.1% and held. It could push. It chose not to. Yet. It did one more thing, small, cruel, efficient. It reached past our ears and placed a label on each of us, tags in a warehouse that would be scanned later. Voss's tag tasted like iron and loss in the lower left side, arm, elbow. Song's tag tasted like dial tone. Delgado's tasted like burnt textbook pages and anatomy diagrams that weren't ours. Heart's tasted like a memory torn into neat strips and reassembled in the shape of compliance. Mine tasted like absence in the shape of a promise I'd made over a kitchen counter 40 miles away. It didn't speak. It didn't have to. It had set the price list and shown us where the cash drawer lived. Failure didn't announce with sirens. It began as a polite rounding error. The field integrity bar on the console ticked from 91.6 to 90.8, and then held as if embarrassed. A second later, every status LED in the rack went high in perfect unison. Too perfect, like a parade ground. Song's analyzer threw a Christmas tree of alerts and then flattened to OK. The hum in the ribs split into two notes slightly out of tune. Geometry blinked. The first cascade was gravity behaving like it had opinions. My lamp beam cut a line through dust motes and the line bent around an angle that didn't exist. The floor grid stretched on my periphery and snapped short when I tried to stare. The room widened in a way that didn't increase volume. It multiplied paths. I marked our entry with paint and watched a second line of the same paint appear a meter to the left, drawn by a version of Delgado who had just finished drawing it. He looked up, frowned at me, then at himself, and then the copy rippled out like a reflection in a puddle kicked by no one. Alarms arrived late, as if someone waited for theater. A rising chirp from the core gantry. A low bellow from the bus. A pleasant female voice from the control console. Field variance out of tolerance. The accent didn't belong to any of our agencies. Song slapped at the console to hunt the shear setting, and I grabbed her wrist. "Don't starve it," I said. Her eyes said she knew. Her hand said, "Reflex runs faster than wisdom." Physics went nonlinear in earned stages. Voss took 3 quick steps to a panel, and 2 of them landed on floor that was floor. The third set his boot on something that remembered being floor and then decided to be sloped. He slid, caught a rib, and swore a name. His rosary spun out of his pocket and hung in the air too long before falling like time had to catch up with itself. Heart reached. Her glove passed through his sleeve and came away warm, from air that was not air. Something pressed into the room from everywhere at once the way a crowd presses into a train car. It had a temperature and a weight and no skin. The ribs sang the wrong triad. The anchor bar fell, 90.8, 88.3, 85.9. The graph labeled heartbeat lost rhythm and started counting down without numbers. Not a countdown, like a rocket. Childhood rhythm, clapping games on a playground, hopscotch squares chalked in a grid that would not stay square. The entity communicated using ideas. It picked our oldest rules and played them until fear made us younger. I fired because action turns a circle into a line. 2 rounds into the lensing at the edge of the core. The report came back crooked, like sound bent around my own muzzle. The bullets did not do what bullets do. The first round curved, walked a graceful parabola, slowed midair as if remembering flowers, flowered into a smear of petals that weren't petals, then sifted down as dust that wasn't dust. The second vanished and returned as a neat coin-shaped absence cut out of a server faceplate 3 feet to the left. The hole had no burr. Delgado made a noise in his throat that metallurgists reserve for miracles and accidents. Rooms grew larger inside than out the way tents feel bigger at midnight. A copy of us moved 2 corridors over in the same room and misaligned by a quarter step. I saw my own head turn and failed to meet my eyes. Song's other self reached for a console that ours didn't have, touched it, and left fingerprints in dust that telegraphed to our side 3 beats later. The chamber held multiple valid maps and none would consent to be chosen. The deal returned as more offer than threat. Stand down, it implied without words, in a flood of childhood games and erased chalk. Submit and become predictable. The clamp is tired. You could help carry. The anchor bar scraped 84.2 and edged toward the number someone had written in the log. If below 84%, sheer. The refuse button in my head fought the save us reflex in my bones. Song, I said. Mirror feeds to local and fake the uplink green. She nodded like a diver given a rope. Fingers moved. Windows split. Her screen showed directories that weren't hers. Create subdirectories named after us. Harlan, Timeslip, Song, Hollow, Voss, Left Arm, Delgado, Foreign, Hart, Nice. The system was making room, preparing invoices. The entity composed a picture out of impressions and set it on my tongue. A kitchen at dawn, keys on a counter, a window measuring light wrong by a hair. The cost if I walked out free. I swallowed and tasted lemon soap and the sour edge of fear. Human stakes sharpened my speech. No volunteers, I said. No altar. We tried to retreat and discovered that leaving had rules now. The door we'd cut sat where we left it and also 1 step to the right and 1 step to the left. A triptych of exits, only one of which was ours. My paint marks multiplied into a fan of possibilities. Pick the wedge, I told them, because the wedge was ours. The rubber chevrons had a scratch I'd put there in a motel in Tonopah. I held that fact like a handrail. We moved in pairs through a room that had become an argument. Hart shepherded Voss first. His boot left a footprint that delayed, arrived, and then stepped ahead of him. He followed his own print into the right exit and almost into the wrong one. Hart's watch ticked loyal. Her pupils told a different time. Delgado grabbed the plate we'd cut free and used it like a shield because metal respects metal, even when math does not. Sparks jumped out of nowhere and died before our eyes had the chance to accept they'd been born. The entity pressed one last message into us all at once, personal and precise. A ring too heavy on a finger that had never been sized, a voice box that translated vowels into filtered tone, a set of surgical drawings that told the truth about an animal that was not quite ours, a memory sequence gently rearranged into compliance. It wasn't a curse, it was a receipt. The anchor bar kissed 84%. A chime sounded like a polite elevator. Song's thumb hovered over control labeled sheer. Confirm? I took her wrist again and shook my head. If we starved the core now, we'd get the quiet we wanted and something else would get the invitation it needed. I chose noise. On me, I said. Home is the wedge. We moved on that noun the way teams move on verbs. The room tried 3 more tricks. A corridor that shrugged longer inside, a set of stairs that wanted to be a ramp, a version of me who was faster and braver a half-step to my right and wrong. I ignored the braver man and stuck with the one who remembered the scratch on the wedge. We broke back through into the stairwell with the kind of silence that follows gunfire in dreams. The chanting cut like a switch. The pressure left my head all at once and made me light. Up was still up. Gravity remembered its job. The hum settled into one tired note that made me think of a generator on its last gallon. Behind us, beneath us, The machine kept working. We had escaped. We hadn't left anything behind. We had taken our costs with us, even if we couldn't read the receipt yet. We came out wrong. The stair spat us onto the slab. Clean desert night swapped for a low-gray dawn that the Flightline weather log would later insist hadn't happened. My watch said 03:11, then 07.41, then corrected to 02.53. Sodium lights flickered in the cadence we'd heard below. Bind, contain, awaken, like a metronome someone had taught to breathe. The wind carried hot dust and transformer varnish that shouldn't live in open air. Voss crumpled against the berm, and I saw it before he did. His left forearm gone from mid-radius down. Not torn, not burned, sealed. Skin ended smooth, as if a surgeon had finished a neat museum display and buffed it. No blood, no stump pain scream, just a gasp and a prayer that came out like a name. His glove lay on the concrete, fingers empty, cuff unfrayed. The rosary in his pocket rattled once and fell still. Song spoke to confirm head count, and the word never arrived. Her lips moved. A clear sign tone replaced syllables. Pure, sterile DTMF on a human mouth. She touched her throat, and the tone slid a half step like a tuner searching and finding. Her eyes said panic. Her hands signed calm. When she keyed her radio, the net filled with dial tone that carried meaning I didn't want to learn. The taste of copper rose again, thin and bright. Hart pulled her Doppler and checked Voss's pulse. She called out vitals in a language that wasn't ours. Terms for vessels that don't belong to people slipped through. Artery names that match something with segmented ribs and a different oxygen plan. She blinked, shook her head, and tried again in English. The second set of vitals sounded like medicine. The first would haunt the inside of my skull later when a veteran surgeon at Nellis wrote a note. Where did she learn this? Please cite source. Hot dust blew across Hart's boots and left a smear like graphite. Delgado stared at his own palms as if the skin would admit new ownership. He lifted the thermal imager, set it on the door plate, and told me the wrong alloy percentages of the right metal in a voice too sure for guesses. Manganese 9.2, nickel 3, silicon 1. It doesn't want to be steel, he said. He wasn't reading a meter. He was reading a memory that didn't originate in this world, and he hated how easy it came. I tried to assemble the night the way you stack spent magazines. Memory filled with a safe, fake version of events like rain pooling in a tarp. There we were in the corridor, cheerful, checking seals, doing nothing stupid. There we were, no weird E&M, no chanting that wasn't, no hatch with Soviet grain metal under Nevada concrete. The story was neat, printable, career-safe. I pressed a fist into the place beside that story and felt the real one refusing to die. Paper in my vest pocket kept its weight. My door wedge scratched on one side. The scratch anchored me. Time insisted on pretending to be normal. A contractor C-130 rolled on the far runway with a sound that arrived wrong, late as if the air had to negotiate. My watch second-hand stepped half-heartedly and asked forgiveness. The sodium pools buzzed like angry insects. I smelled lemon-harsh hand gel from Hart's kit and the heat from the bay door bleeding out through steel that shouldn't have been warm. Human steak cut through every instrument lie. My phone buzzed. Service lived here only when it wanted to. A photo waited from the person 40 miles away, a key on a string next to a ring on a counter I had never bought. The ring wore an engraving I could not explain, triangles nested inside arcs, a small dot where my thumb wanted to rest. The caption said, "You said yes before sunrise. Window measurements later?" I stared until the words shifted and settled into a timeline that did not happen. We moved because standing still lets the room choose you. I loaded Voss into the truck with the one-armed grace of a man who didn't want help. Heart taped, wrapped, and anchored without blood. Song typed with machine dial tone humming at the end of every motion. A metronome for panic. Delgado filed serials in a voice that knew the metallurgy of things he hadn't touched yet. I drove with gloved hands that shook at red lights that weren't there. Hard cut. The service gate swallowed us and spit us into a base that pretended the night was fine. The guard's wand blinked green and green and green. My vest felt heavier by a watch and a wedge and the debt of a promise I had already failed to keep. They split us by room, then by vocabulary. The official debrief wore an old carpet and a new camera lens. The man with the clipboard called me Sergeant, though I wasn't, and asked questions in a cadence designed to record only the pretty version. I gave him file names that wouldn't open and timestamps that corrected themselves. He wrote, "Integrity sweep, nominal," before I'd finished a sentence. The air tasted like stale coffee and paper. Medical came as theater. Scans said, "within normal limits." Voss held up his sealed arm and the tech didn't flinch. "Congenital," he read from a monitor that showed nothing abnormal. He typed the word and shrugged. Hart argued, quiet and precise, and the attending smiled with teeth you could count. "Psychosomatic overlay," he said as if that explained absent anatomy. The smell of disinfectant rode high, sharp as lemon solvent. Song tried to speak. Dial tone answered. The ENT wrote functional voice disorder, conversion, on a line already prepared. He tapped a tuning fork, held it to her mastoid, and nodded as if that were proof. She raised a hand and signed every comms term we'd lived by. The recorder on the desk captured perfect silence and returned a file marked 0 bytes. The nurse offered lozenges. Song laughed. The tone climbed a half step and sounded like a modem from a museum waking up. Delgado's promotion arrived in a manila envelope, heavy with a badge that opened a lab. The cover story said, "Materials Forensics Liaison." The job turned out to be faking normalcy on alloys that refused to sit in a periodic table drawn for this planet. He touched a sample and tasted nickel and a faint dust that came off old radiators. His mouth learned words for crystalline habits that lived in geometries we hadn't imported yet. He slept sitting up for a week and dreamt in grain structures. Hart transferred to a research clinic with human performance painted on the glass. They handed her a curriculum she had never read and aced. Trauma care for bodies with segmented ribs, vascular maps that matched neither anatomy atlases nor any animal you could find in a zoo. She wrote notes in a neat hand that administrators photocopied and marked controlled. The smell in her new lab was antiseptic and ozone, the bite of machines that hum when no one asks. Voss received a medal without a ceremony and a quiet memo offering a prosthetic he didn't need, fitted over a limb that ended smooth and refused to accept a socket. They issued him a new access band tied to a function that had no name, work that smelled like diesel and chapel air. He carried his rosary on the right side now and learned to tie a tourniquet one-handed with his teeth. He stopped looking at the place where the arm wasn't. The base didn't see it either. My debrief transcript arrived for signature already written in my voice, paragraphs I hadn't spoken. No anomalies observed. Radiological survey negative. Seal integrity confirmed. I read it once and twice. The safe fake story moved into my memory the way rain moves into a low room. When I tried to speak the truth, my tongue hit words and slid away. I signed a page that wasn't mine with a hand that felt borrowed. They repurposed our gifts. Song's dial tone became an interface in a room without windows. Machines responded when she couldn't speak. Delgado's alloy instincts fed procurement that never published. Hart's cross-species medicine trained men who wore badges I hadn't seen before. Voss stood in places where geometry bent and didn't fall. I got an email thanking me for discretion and an invitation to a promotion board in a building with a broken clock that never got fixed. The cameras worked perfectly in every corridor except the ones we needed. The official record showed uptime and normal operations. Our 0-byte files lived on a server that swore it had never met them. The loop I'd seen, 4 minutes and 8 seconds of a corridor teaching a lens to look at itself, never appeared in chain of custody. The men who should have wanted it pretended not to know the word. They moved us like pieces on a board so a future debrief would have fewer nouns to discover. Transfers to offices with plausible desks. New badges with old codes. Fresh NDAs printed on warmer paper. Pay increases measured to keep mouths shut. We learned to wear the lie as cover. We learned to answer to names we didn't like. We learned that the hum off a FAR transformer can be louder than a siren. I assemble the pattern in present tense because it never stopped. The map fills itself when I lay these reports side by side. Different uniforms, same hum. The dates matter. Falklands, 17th May 2008. SAS detachment rotating through Mount Pleasant, range maintenance cover. Hardware. A decommissioned radar hut on the York Bay perimeter. Anomaly, the Plessy AR-3D set. Power removed for a decade, returns a contact at 0 range and then paints its own dish. Outcome. 3 operators report pressure tone in headsets. 1 blackout, 1 misdated watch by 4 hours. Official log reads generator test. The hut is bricked the next week. I confirm the brickwork from satellite change detection. The bricks don't match local supply. The smell noted in an unofficial email, hot dust and copier ozone. Murmansk Oblast, 02, February 1997. Spetsnaz team moves on a mothballed Daryl radar node near Olenegorsk. Hardware. Phased array face half dismantled, cable runs scavenged. Anomaly. Thermal cameras show heat veins in concrete with no power to sight. Voices record as flat carrier. Footsteps with a hitch echo with no source. Outcome. 2 team members file for early medical discharge. Notes cite idiopathic limb loss with sealed presentation. The base fence line shifts 2 meters on survey drawings filed 6 months later. The surveyor's pencil note reads, in Russian, "The wall isn't where it is." Nunavut, 11th March 2015. USAF inspectors visit a north warning system, DW line successor node on Boothia Peninsula for sensor drift. Hardware, wind-scoured radar dome, diesel jennies, dated HP switch with label maker tags. Anomaly, the array paints itself. The dish is a contact. Field integrity alarm on a local console labeled Anchor Feed dips to 84% and then stabilizes. Outcome, visiting medic later writes anatomy notes that reference vessels not in human charts. The dome is listed as decommissioned and quietly mothballed with a generator left on for remote maintenance. The tone reported by 1 tech. Not a tone. Pressure, Nova Scotia Shelf, 23rd September 2003. Navy SOSUS technician on midnight watch flags a pattern not acoustic. Hardware, hydrophone array, analog front end, digital post. Anomaly. Harmonic picket fence rises at low end with intervals that match children's clapping games across 3 cultures. The map draws a contact under the cable head. The system begins writing directories named after the watchstander's call signs. Outcome. The anomaly is labeled biologic and archived. The tech receives a quiet transfer to a new unit with better pay and no windows. He writes on the back of his locker card, "It learned me." Nevada, 14th November of our year. Groom Lake, West Perimeter Test Bay by elevation diagram, legacy conduits. Hardware, bronze dark ribs wired into modern racks, label strips, Damascus, anchor array. Anomaly, footsteps without shadows, shadows without feet. Cameras that watch but don't save, radios that show connected and return nothing. Outcome. 5 people leave with costs measured in limb, voice, knowledge, memory. The base resumes normal operations. The Level 4 ring that missed everything is filed as local buffer only for bandwidth hygiene. This isn't isolated. This is doctrine. The labels change. The ribs persist. Someone takes old metal that already knows the angles, wires it into our grids, and calls it containment. When the field dips, the bill lands in human currency. The ledger stays clean because the debts disperse. Time shaved, memory sanded, bodies edited smooth. The pattern behaves like a network, with regional flavors. The smell stays the same. Hot dust, varnish, the bite of a 9-volt on the tongue. The metronome keeps time we didn't consent to. The map redraws itself around that beat. I'm in a room the size of a small office with a soft hum that shouldn't exist. The walls are quiet drywall. The air tastes like printer ozone. The lights flicker in the cadence I know: bind, contain, awaken. And the second hand on my watch stands still like a soldier refusing a bad order. It jerks forward, then recants, then arrives somewhere I didn't send it. Footsteps pass outside the door with a hitch every 3rd step, heavy and then not, like someone carrying a load that doesn't exist. My phone wakes without a notification. The screen shows a voicemail icon with a timestamp for tomorrow. I press play. Dial tone speaks first, pure and clean. Then her voice, the one 40 miles away, laundry soap and lemon, says a line I never gave her. "You said yes before sunrise. Window measurements later?" The ring that never existed sits on my desk. It wasn't there when I sat down. Engraving shines in office light. Triangles nested inside arcs with a dot where my thumb fits like it had been here for years. The metal is warm. On the wall, faint and exact, a new pattern blooms where paint should be smooth. Burned in geometry that mirrors the ribs under Nevada. Arcs, triangles, calibration marks, a lattice that teaches space to remember a shape. My lamp beam bends a fraction when it passes. The hum sits in the throat like a swallowed coin. The door handle cools under my fingers and then warms without reason. The footsteps stop outside and the gap at the bottom of the door darkens as if a shadow tested the seal and found it acceptable. I don't have to open the door to understand that distance is a word, not a wall. It is here now. The Level 4 cameras across the hall watch and won't save. The local buffer will fill with 0-byte files. The lights will correct their flicker and the timestamp will reconcile after I'm done. The hum isn't a warning. It's a welcome mat. The machine under the desert never stopped. It learned to render rooms. The ring tightens infinitesimally on my finger when I test its weight. The engraving presses like a pulse. My watch moves and then doesn't. The second hand lays down and plays dead. A faint child's clap pattern taps itself on the inside of my skull. Game rhythms from a playground I never walked. A breath moves the office air that isn't air. The voicemail plays again without a command and ends with the soft click of a receiver in a world that still uses them. You're part of the loop now because you know the rhythm. Keep watching, and it will learn you faster.